Hello, Grand Archive players. Let's answer a rules question. How and when exactly do you win or lose a game of Grand Archive? Every game of Grand Archive ends, and the vast majority of them end pretty straightforwardly. For those that don't, let's look at some rules. A player wins if each of their opponents loses via one of the following ways. The champion dies, they do not control a champion, or losing from drawing from an empty deck. A player can also win or lose by a card effect that would directly win or lose the game. Conceding the game is obviously a loss. Lastly, a player loses if they would somehow win and lose simultaneously. That last one's basically a contingency case if something truly bizarre were to happen, and is currently not possible, so let's not worry about that one. Conceding is pretty self-explanatory and doesn't have to do mechanically with the rules. And there are no effects in Grand Archive that win or lose the game directly, so we can also disregard those for now. For the video, we'll be focusing on how a player loses the game. Not necessarily because we're being glass half empty here, but because almost all of the ways to win a game involve all of your opponents losing. We're left with these three loss conditions: champion dying, losing your champion in some other way, and drawing from an empty deck, colloquially known as decking out. All three of these are state-based checks. By the way, those others that we disregarded earlier, that involve directly winning or losing, are not necessarily state-based checks. State-based checks are performed automatically by the game to clean up the game state in between any player getting opportunity. Examples include moving lethally damaged non-immortal units to the graveyard, destroying weapons with no durability, and moving a unique object to the graveyard if a player controls multiple unique objects with the same name. State-based checks are performed before and after any player gets opportunity, but not during the resolution of a singular trigger or activation on the stack, and can't be responded to. They just happen at those designated times. So, if there was a trigger or activation threatening lethal damage to end the game on a champion, for example, if player A activates Fireball for lethal damage on player B's champion, player B can respond with a lethal activation of their own. Since state-based checks are performed in between each item of the stack, player A could lose the game before their own Fireball resolves. Of course, they can respond to player B by preventing the damage, recovering, negating, or making a lethal attempt of their own. Even if there are pending items on the stack, the game will end in between them if any loss conditions are met. As an aside, what actually happens when a player loses the game? As soon as a player loses during a state-based check, everything they control is immediately removed from the game. This includes cards in all zones, all objects on the field, and anything pending on the stack. In our example, if player B's Fireball killed A's champion, A's Fireball wouldn't get to resolve. Or if there was an object under the control with some kind of static effect, that effect would immediately cease to apply. Any continuous effects such as control changing effects will also expire. Normally, all of this is inconsequential because standard Grand Archive is played as a two-player game, where the game ends when one player loses. It doesn't matter what happens after a player loses because there's no more game to play. But in any potential future format where a player has multiple opponents, this could be relevant. So, because losing the game is a state-based check, if a damage event would deal lethal damage to a champion and also cause any triggers, those triggers won't be able to affect the game state. For example, if a champion was dealt lethal damage through a Searing Rebuke, the return damage trigger wouldn't even get a chance to resolve. Likewise too, the on-death trigger of a Furnace Drone that died at the same time as its controlling champion, the damage trigger of a Bloodbond Bladesworn, or the recover triggers of a Magebane Lash, would all be too late to resolve if their controller's champion died to lethal damage during the same activation or trigger. These effects would trigger, but since they need to use the stack, the game would be over before they could resolve. If both champions are dealt lethal damage, which is seen by the game in a single state-based check, the game ends in a draw and neither player wins. This can happen if an activation, trigger, or combat damage step results in both champions taking damage simultaneously. For combat damage, since most champions can't retaliate, that scenario would most likely involve retaliations from allies with ambush or against an attacker with cleave. This can cause a draw if both champions would be dealt lethal damage in the same combat damage step. Note that in rare situations, the damage doesn't have to be exactly simultaneous, as long as it occurs within a single activation or trigger. For example, if player A activates Cone of Frost at level 5, dealing 2 lethal damage to their own champion, 2 damage again to their own champion, and 2 lethal damage to player B's champion, after this activation resolves, the subsequent state-based check will declare both champions to have died at the same time and the game will be a draw. The game doesn't care about the fact that A's champion received more damage total and slightly sooner than player B's champion did. It only checks a binary condition of the champion dying or not dying during state-based checks. A quick note about immortality. Champions with immortality will not die except by the unique rule, whether that be by damage or an effect that tries to directly destroy them. Jin's immortality stops applying during the end phase, so he stops being immortal and can die, starting with state-based checks at the beginning of his end phase. Let's look at another lost condition, attempting to draw from an empty main deck. Note that having an empty main deck is not itself a lost condition. Nothing happens if a player's deck becomes empty, or if they play while it is empty. However, the draw phase is not optional, so they'll need to find a solution pretty fast. Also note that only effects that use the word draw count as drawing a card, whether that be to hand or to memory. If it doesn't use the word draw, for example, Fairy Whispers, Rally the Peasants, Hire Mercenaries, and Regal Inquisition, will not result in a loss if activated even with an empty deck. These effects put cards directly into hand or memory and might resemble drawing cards, but do not count as card draws. Again, this loss condition is checked as a state-based check. So if, for example, player A activates Increasing Danger while both players' decks are empty, it will result in a draw, even though player A drew more cards and drew cards first. State-based checks are only performed after the full resolution of Increasing Danger, and we'll see that both players have just attempted to draw from an empty deck. Also, the game will know if you tried to draw from an empty deck, even if your deck is no longer empty. If a player activates Buried Grief with 1 or 0 cards in deck, the game will still issue a loss for trying to draw from an empty deck, even if it's no longer empty when state-based checks are performed. Okay, what we've discussed so far should account for most of the fraction of games that don't end simply by one champion dying to damage. You could go your entire Grand Archive career without needing to know any more than this. However, there are some more exotic scenarios that can result in the end of the game. Before we proceed, I have to confess, I haven't been completely truthful about something. There is a bit of information I've been leaving out because it wasn't relevant, and that is, state-based checks are not all created equal. Before performing normal state-based checks, the game will first perform a pass for game-ending state-based checks, that is, the ones I mentioned before. Let's take a look at this example. Player A activates Juggle Knives with class bonus with no cards in deck to deal lethal damage to player B. What is the outcome of this game? Let's take a very close look at the sequence of events here. I'll put up this visual timeline to help us out. First, the resolution of Juggle Knives, which is a single activation with 2 events within it. It will deal 1 damage to player B's champion, which is now lethally damaged. Remember, lethally damaged units do not die until state-based checks. Then, player A attempts to draw a card and cannot do so. The game makes note of this. Juggle Knives has finished resolving and is moved to its owner's graveyard. Then, the game performs state-based checks, starting with game-ending checks. And here we will notice something interesting. Player A has fulfilled the conditions to lose the game, while player B's champion has not yet died. That would happen immediately afterward, during normal state-based checks. Therefore, the game ends now, with player A losing. One way a player can lose that we haven't looked at yet is by not controlling a champion when they controlled one before. This is to make it so that players don't lose the game before putting out their level 0 spirit at the beginning of the game. One way this can happen is through de-leveling, which puts the top card of a champion lineage into its owner's material deck. This might happen if someone lineage releases their entire inner lineage, then de-levels. Or simply by de-leveling with only 1 champion card in their lineage. However, these situations are rare since it requires that player to intentionally lose the game entirely by their own choices. Are there perhaps other ways to lose in this way? Let's dig a bit deeper. Trisket, Guidance Angel, is a card with a very unique ability. Her on-enter trigger allows her controller to optionally banish their champion and have Trisket become their champion instead. Remember that since state-based checks are not checked until after this trigger resolves, you won't immediately lose the game when your champion is banished this way, as long as you control a champion, namely Trisket, afterward. You can respond to this on-enter trigger by removing Trisket from the field, destroying, returning to hand or memory, suppressing, etc. When the trigger resolves, it will do everything it can and ignore what it can't. So you may accept Trisket's contract and banish your champion. But if Trisket isn't there, she can't become your new champion, and that instruction is skipped. Upon the resolution of this trigger, state-based checks will find that you don't control a champion, and you will immediately lose. It is entirely your choice for this to happen upon the resolution of the trigger, so there's not really a reason to do this. There's not any opportunity to respond during Trisket's trigger, so it's not like another player can trick you into doing something like this. Alternatively, let's say your champion was already Trisket, and another Trisket enters the field under your control. You'll need to drop 1 into the graveyard, since they are both unique objects with the same name under your control. If you choose to sacrifice your champion Trisket, you will immediately lose the game before the on-enter trigger even gets to try to resolve. Again, this is entirely optional, and there's not really a reason to do this. Note that a similar card, Lubu, Indomitable Titan, can also become a champion, but does so via a replacement effect rather than a triggered ability, so these interactions don't work with it. Seize Fate is a card with a very unique ability. Upon resolution, its controlled champion gains the following effect indefinitely. If they would take damage, they recover instead, and get banished if they recover to 0. This is a replacement effect that applies to any damage event that would deal damage to this champion. Let's see how this effect shakes out with some familiar examples. Player B is under the effect of C's fate. Some kind of activation, trigger, or combat damage step results in both champions becoming lethally damaged at the same time. That is, for player B, the damage put their champion to 0 damage counters. What is the outcome of the game? Let's take a close look at the sequence of events. Both players' champions take damage. C's fate's replacement effect causes player B's champion to recover instead. Part of this replacement effect is also to banish the champion in this circumstance, so player B's champion becomes banished. Then, game-ending state-based checks are performed, seeing that player B no longer controls their champion and assigns them a loss. The game ends immediately during this check, before the game checks that player A's lethally damaged champion has died. How about this example? Player B's champion is under the effect of C's fate with 1 damage counter. Player A has no cards in deck and activates Juggle Knives with class bonus targeting player B's champion. What is the outcome of this game? Again, let's look carefully at the sequence of events. Juggle Knives deals 1 damage to player B's champion, who recovers to 0 and gets banished. Player A attempts to draw a card from an empty deck. Juggle Knives has finished resolving. The game performs game-ending checks and see that both players have simultaneously met the condition for a loss, and this game ends in a draw. So now, if any of these things happen in one of your games, you know what to do. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.